Hi. Well, hi. I'm Megan. I'm the Executive Director with Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. Bob, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Bob, and I'm the environmental technician with Oz, and I'll be helping out with the first part of the presentation today.
Well, so for everyone who had joined us on Monday night, we went over our shelter belt basics. Do we have any new participants here tonight? Not sure how to not single anyone out. If we comment in the the chat. But if you do have any questions or if you want anything explained further or looking for more information that was missed maybe on Monday, just mention in the chat or direct message Bob when I'm talking or myself when Bob's talking, and we can give you a little bit more of an explanation. All right. So tonight we're going to go a little bit more in depth into shelter belts. So off the bat, we'll do some kind of advanced topics to think about when you're planning your shelter belt, followed by some more information on kind of some of the practical steps in planting. I've got a couple of new people tonight. All right. So yeah, just like Christine had mentioned, the presentation from Monday night will be available to view. So you can view that one after the fact and kind of get some of that basic information if you find yourself kind of lost or on unstable footing on any of this stuff here. All right, so an acknowledgement, Oz would like to acknowledge that in conducting the presentation and in our work, we are operating on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Indigenous people of Canada, as well as the traditional lands of the Métis people of Canada. All right, we're the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society. So we are a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to increase the awareness of the economic, social, and environmental values of forested areas on our agricultural landscape. So we provide education and information to rural Albertans, as well as not-for-profit organizations, government representatives, anyone who's looking for some education on planting and care of trees. We also help with delivery of projects. So if there's some areas of expertise that are missing and folks are looking for some extra help, Oz can help out with some of those aspects too. About us, so I'm Megan, the Executive Director of the organization. Our contact information, it's all up on our website. If anyone needs to get a hold of us, just reach out. Elizabeth, our communication coordinator, I think she's in the background helping out with any questions, as well as Bob.
Hi.
Hi. As well as Bob, an environmental technician, and Bob's going to share part of the presenting as well tonight. So our not-for-profit, we rely on our very generous membership to support our organization. So our members are from across Alberta, and they're helping deliver our kind of strategy for operations, as well as helping support Oz in all of our work that we do. Funding for this particular workshop, primarily through ALUS Northern Sunrise County, as well as the presentation material help for developing that was through Canadian Agricultural Partnership and the Alberta Real Estate Foundation. Okay, so tonight our presentation, we'll go through those shelter belt design considerations. So we'll work with our landscape and how to best design your shelter belt based on your landscape. We'll optimize for snow and wind protection. We're going to look at a little more in depth at species selection, including planting for fruit production, which is one of the most one of the most common themes this year we're hearing is folks are looking for some edibles, berries. We're looking at water management to kind of help improve water resources on your property, around your property, directing that moisture for best use, designing for wildlife carbon storage, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail on the actual steps for establishing shelter belts, steps for restoring perhaps older shelter belts that need some work, and we'll take a look at some of those local resources that you can access. Okay, and yeah, then I'll hand it over to Bob to go through some of those shelter belt design considerations.
Alrighty, I'll just pop my screen up here. Okay. All right, yeah, so like with Monday's session, we kind of went over the basics of shelter belts, covered a lot of the ecosystem services they have, and some of the more basic design components. And then so today we're going to kind of dig a little deeper into that and kind of look at different scenarios for shelter belts and how to best design to meet your goals based on those decisions. So up first, just kind of a quick overview of, it's always important to consider the planting zone that you're located in. As you can see with this cool map from the Government of Canada, kind of shows a range of the growing zones for Canada. So if we're looking at Alberta, majority of it is, it's in those 2 and 3 growing zones. And then with some differences in between there for the A and B categories. But, where we at are in Edmonton, well, for the roughly around that 3B growing zone. But if you go in different parts of the country, you can see as you go lower, you're getting into some of those, nicer growing zones where a few different plant species can survive and thrive, especially if you look at Vancouver Island, kind of the only place in Canada for that 7B growing zone. So always important to consider that when you're selecting plant species for your shelter belt or ecobuffer, because if you choose accordingly, those will have the best success. Okay, so working with the landscape, that's kind of how you want to go about designing your shelter belt. So there's going to be different topographical features, the lay of the land, as far as the contouring of the land, and the general makeup in terms of basic, substrate conditions and moisture conditions. So just a few examples here, scenarios that you'd want to consider. Perchance if you're planting on slope landscape, picking some species that are going to have strong root systems that can lock down that soil, ultimately preventing erosion and, keeping that land in place, especially with water runoff events. And then if you have, depressions or ditches in the land that you're going to be planting over, those generally will have higher moisture content just due to, gravity, wanting to place that water in the lowest pot possible. So you're going to have greater moisture accumulation. So choosing, plant species that have a nice moisture tolerance or really enjoy water and are going to be able to uptake that without being overwhelmed would be a consideration. As well as, with upland landscapes, the higher you get, generally lower moisture levels. So you want species that can tolerate a range of moisture conditions or, thrive in drier moisture conditions. Another example, different substrate, whether, sandy, clay, loam, certain species will be able to match in all those conditions, whereas others will have a preference. So certain species, like balsam fir, some pine. You'll notice they're, located in the mountains where it's a little bit rockier, and they can tolerate that condition. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you're choosing species that are going to be able to basically benefit from the site conditions and flourish, as well as improve your location from the services that they can perform. So just looking at planting design overall, this is really good. Oop, go back one slide there. It's a really good image because it kind of shows all the different scenarios you can have in an agricultural landscape or an acreage landscape. So kind of starting on that top part of the picture there, we have a natural barnyard with that kind of ring there. So that's really good for livestock protection from abiotic stressors such as wind or sun. And then you got a nice corner based shelter belt maximizing protection from prevailing winds. On the left hand side you have some basically some almost alley cropping with the tree placement there in rows. So what that can do is, as the sun travels from east to west, you're going to get differing times for shade and sunlight, and your livestock can move around and take advantage of that, as well as crops if you had that in between instead. And then moving down, we got kind of a more natural area with sporadic trees, so kind of a silvo pasture situation with a nice tree belt surrounding both sides of the riparian area there as well, and protecting that. And then in the kind of the right bottom side, we see how people have utilized shelter belts to protect property such as the barn, the homestead, garden, feedlots there, ultimately strategically placing those trees to get the most benefits as far as protection. So again, if you have natural areas on your property that are already treed, or water bodies, rocky outcroppings, it's important to consider incorporating that into your design to also just simply help you as far as extending the protection and connecting wildlife habitat. And like I said before, different designs will bring different are better for different uses and will bring different benefits. So it's, as you can see in here, there's many different options. And then building that kind of grid system where you go north to south, east to west, that's going to give you the best protection from stressors. So here's a little graphic kind of showing the overall design of a multiple row shelter belt and what that kind of staggering effect can have as far as protection from wind and snow. So as you see with the wind and snow coming in down across the shelter belt, you have that first row that's staggered of smaller bushes, and then taller deciduous trees, and then the last row of slow growing tall coniferous trees. And when you stagger those out and space them accordingly here with the 1 meter, 2.5, and 3.5 meter, you're getting the best coverage as far as blocking wind. So certain, when wind or snowfall is coming through, it's kind of a filtering effect, or the Swiss cheese effect, where, you line up multiple rows of Swiss cheese, not all the holes are going to line up, and you're going to get that protection. So that kind of basically has long-term success, as opposed to just completely overlapping rows of trees, and then you'll get those wind tunnels passing through. The fewer rows in a shelter belt ultimately will force, if you only can plant a few rows, it's going to force you possibly to plant closer if you want to maintain similar protection, because you'll have less rows to create that offset or staggering effect. And ultimately, for when you're using more rows, as long as if you're planting by a fence with livestock on the other side, ideally you want to keep that 2 meter distance as well from the fence, basically to prevent overeager livestock from browsing and reaching across for a tasty snack. So spacing is important, and you want to make sure that you do that at the start, so it's not going to be a problem later on. Okay. So last class we talked about wind and snow trapping, and just kind of going into it a little bit more here. So basically with this graph, you can kind of see that the first row of shrubs is going to be accumulating the most snow. And as it passes through the shelter belt, the more rows you have, the more snow that's going to be trapped within those rows that doesn't get passed on over top. As well as snow passes through, less and less is going to be accumulating in the further rows. So, and then, like I said, when we talked about last class, creating that ramp or that dome shape on either side is going to it's going to kick up that air so it passes on overhead. And then once it's up there, you're going to have a greater zone of protection as opposed to a single species of, say, bush or a tall tree, where, you know, it's kind of like a speed bump. It's only going to stop it so much. So that shrub row at the start on the windward side is going to be your lifting effect. And they're effective snow trappers, and they're going to protect those taller trees from deep snow accumulation, which can potentially have a destructive effect on them. And then the deciduous tree row, that's going to continue that lift, and also catch and release snow, as they tend to be a little more porous for wind and snow passing through. And then the evergreens, that last row, kind of your last line of defense, they provide a greater density, so they're filtering out the remnants of snow, as well as they provide the best shelter for wildlife during storms, whether it's a snowstorm or a summer storm. So really good shelter. And again, just a reminder that when you're designing shelter belts, they're going to be trapping that snow. So it's always important to design them with buildings or roads in mind. So it's always advised to not plant within 30 meters of buildings or roads to avoid that excessive snow trapping, potentially blocking roads. And ideally would be anywhere from 30 to 90 meters away, just to play it safe, especially with extreme events. And then just a reminder that snow accumulation usually occurs at a distance of double the height of the shelter belt on the leeward side, so opposite of the windward side. So, and then again, when you have short and dense foliage, that's going to trap snow in a concentrated short distance, versus tall and thin foliage, which is going to basically distribute that snow more evenly over a longer distance, as opposed to if there wasn't anything there. So it's good for distributing that snow over a field, and then you'll have a more even snow melt. And yeah, again, multiple row shelter belts, you're gonna have more trapped in between, more rows, more snow trapped. And you want to make sure that when you're designing those shelter belts, to have them perpendicular to prevailing winds. And again, that's for max protection, so you're not getting winds coming in when you have protection facing the wrong way. Ultimately, if you're in an area with lower snowfall and your primary goal is to catch that snowfall for moisture infiltration in the spring, create denser shelter belts, and that'll help you direct that snow where you want it, because it'll be accumulating closer to those shelter belts. And that kind of goes into designing shelter belts to provide snow melt to dugouts. So shelter belts, say if they're planted on the north or the west side of a dugout, they'll trap that snow and direct it down, especially if it's a sloping area, and help recharge dugouts for moisture accumulation. So I'll have a graphic on that a couple slides down. So here's a really good example of what can happen as far as wind events on single rows of trees or shelter belts. So with these, you can see these pine trees have been uprooted due to strong winds. So basically, when you have tall trees like this that are not protected with those first kind of rows that create that ramp effect, they're kind of isolated and they get hit with the full brunt of the wind force. And if they're shallow rooted trees, especially as some spruce trees can be, that can be ultimately the undesirable end result. So when you design those shelter belts with a nice dome shape, multiple rows, you can help prevent that and protect those tall trees from getting that, blunt wind effect and uprooting them. And that kind of plays into longevity. So different species will age at different rates. So ideally, when you're creating that shelter belt, species diversity in the age category is really important. So I want to include both long-lived and short-lived species that are adapted to your site conditions. So you can kind of see in this graphic, we got the tall pioneer trees, say aspen or hybrid poplar. They're popping up first, and they're providing that wind protection as quick as possible with that smaller row of shrubs in the front and those spruce or pine trees that are going to be growing at a slower rate. But as time goes on, those pioneer trees potentially could die off and be replaced with new ones, while those spruce trees are growing up, getting fuller, getting taller, and they'll be helping out with creating a more full shelter belt. So that way your shelter belt is kind of maintaining that density and protection the whole time, as opposed to just planting species that age out faster, and then you'll have a shelter belt that's going to look not very nice, and it's not going to be doing an effective job in a few decades. So basically you want to increase that height and length of your shelter belt because that's going to increase the protected and benefited area. So here's a cool kind of data page of some popular common shelter belt species. And you can kind of see the difference as far as their lifespan. So on the right side, you got the coniferous species with the longest age rates, popular ones like white spruce, some pine going to that 100-year range. And then you see those deciduous trees. And you can see that hybrid popular one in the bottom middle there, only 15 to 30 years. So again, you got to be careful because those ones are going to provide, nice protection right away. But, later on, you got to plan accordingly so that you have species coming up to replace them. And then you can see in shrubs, you get kind of a mix depending on what you're planting, some 10 to 20, some longer lived species like the lilac, and then you have carragana, which never dies. So you won't have to worry about that one. It'll come back to haunt you. So you got lots of options, but you always want to consider the different age rates. So here's a kind of a neat graphic of showing you how to avoid wind tunnels. So when you're designing shelter belts, you're going to have points of access or just natural features where you won't be planting trees. And instead of leaving that gap open and creating wind tunnels, you can plan accordingly for that. So that first half of the screen, basically they just planted a small row in front, and that basically protects that wind tunnel, as well as the bottom one where you kind of have that staggered approach. So you're kind of creating kind of an S shape or an angle, and again prevents the wind from basically creating that tunnel effect going through. So if you have the option, it's always a good thing to consider that when designing. And then, yeah, just mentioning prevailing winds. So here's an example with Alberta. You can kind of see spring. So where we are in the globe, we got westerlies. So the majority of the time our wind is coming from the northwest or the west direction. But in spring, it kind of changes a bit, but overall summer, fall, and winter tend to be the same. You got that western direction coming down from the north as well. So, and we can see fall and winter here, similar patterns. So it's always important to make sure you're designing your shelter belts, if you're after protection, to be perpendicular to those prevailing winds. That way you're getting the maximum benefit and protection. Yeah, so a couple of slides on planting for fruit and nut production. So you want to think about the species needs. So again, like I mentioned with that graph at the start, make sure you're planting in the hardiness zone so that you can actually get some fruit to harvest, as well as maximizing the sun exposure. So depending on where you're planting, you want to make sure they're not going to be overshadowed by other species in the shelter belt, as well as making sure that moisture tolerances are being respected, as well as far as the water table. Some species are nitrogen fixing. So when you do that, you're potentially aiding other species in your shelter belt, because lots of plants need nitrogen, but it can be scarce in soil. But some, legume plants, some fruit producing plants, they work with bacteria in their roots to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available in soil. Because there's lots of nitrogen in the air we breathe. It's actually 78% nitrogen. So they help pull that out and work with the plants. And then in doing that, those nitrogen fixing plants can help out the other species by improving nitrogen content in the soil. So here, just got some examples. So the buffalo berry and green alder, and just kind of showing that they can add that nitrogen nutrient up to 20 meters from some fixing shrubs, which can be a big benefit for other species. So kind of stressing that, compatible relationship benefits. Moving on, we got some water management. So depending on the species and location you're planting, you can benefit from kind of helping control water on your land. As I said before in the last course, we had, or we're talking about the different ways that they can help with water management. So that rain interception, so kind of acting as an umbrella with all the foliage and the trunk, so it slows down velocity of rainfall, which gives the soil more time to absorb that moisture, as well as the roots create macropores in the soil. So woody plants, the roots tend to be a lot bigger and travel further than, say, herbaceous or grasses plants. By doing that, they they create better transportation for water, as well as better structure in the soil. So you're not getting compacted soil. So that allows that water to infiltrate soil and increase the moisture content, as well as in runoff events. The basic, foliage on the ground creates frictional resistance, and that again slows down water. So when you have those shelter belts strategically located on your land, that can help a lot with improving moisture rates, as well as reducing flood events. I'm just going to go back here one sec. Yeah, okay. And then here, like I mentioned earlier, about the dugouts. So if you have dugouts and you want to maintain that moisture or reinforce it, you can see on the left there how designing the shelter belts with the slope in mind, they can help increase that moisture content running into those dugouts, especially when they're trapping snow and then you have the spring melt. So whether you're placing your dugout first or you're placing your shelter belt first, it's something you can keep in mind if that's a strategy or a goal you're after. On the right, you can see this is a dugout that has been kind of overgrown with willow. So it's kind of something you don't ideally want to have happen, because all that detritus and organic matter can fill up the dugout. So basically, they're just planted too close. But kind of the right mindset as far as aiding that dugout and moisture accumulation, just not as close and with a little more upkeep involved. Next, we got the really neat permaculture idea or technique called Swales. You can see on this picture at Cohen Farm, they already have some swales on the land. So those are those snake-like grooves you see. There's one being built here. And basically what swales are they're shallow level trenches that are dug into the ground along contour lines, the natural contour lines of the landscape where you're getting a difference in elevation. So it's a passive water harvesting technique where basically it protects against erosion and improves water filtration. And how they do that is they collect rainwater that runs off the land, slowing and stopping that runoff and collecting it in those dugouts. And that basically hydrates the surrounding soil. And what ends up happening is you can plant vegetation along that to take advantage of that increased moisture tolerance and provide the resulting ecosystem benefits. So in number 1 swale on this image, basically it had a total length of 740 meters and was 4 meters wide by 0.125 meters deep, just to give an idea of what some dimensions can be for swales. So yeah, as we can see here, just 2 quick graphics kind of showing how swales act along those contour lines. And then basically you want to be planting along those swales. And the way that works is when you remove that soil from creating swales, it's placed on the downhill side, and that's called the berm. And so water from the swale plumes out under that berm and increases the soil moisture. So that berm offers a really good location for for planting tree cover, basically to help lock down the soil and decrease erosion. So you're adding erosion control, and you're planting species that are going to take advantage of those increased moisture levels. And another important thing is you want to be able to place catchments or spillways in events where you have excess water, and those basically act as safety nets to collect that excess water, so you don't have runaway spillage. So those can be placed on either end, working with the slope of the land for that drainage. Another important thing to consider is swales aren't applicable to all landscapes, so you typically don't want them on too steep of slopes, so anything greater than 15% in the grade, as well as in areas that are already well hydrated enough. You typically want to avoid that. And then when you're planting those species on those berms, again, you want species that are suited to the local climate, soil, and landscape, as well as obviously they have to be moisture loving or moisture tolerant species, as well as with strong roots to help anchor that soil. So some sample species like wolf willow, certain hybrid poplar, balsam poplar, red osier dogwood, high bush cranberry, all those can be excellent ones. Here, just for a fun example, is the CDC Center North, where Oz is based out of. And you can see, I just went on a quick map contouring program online, and you can basically pick an area and it'll highlight the change in elevation. So the blue line in the center, that's where it's lowest. And each one of these lines is 1 meter in difference. So the orange line being the the highest point of the land. And then you can see how they're all gradually sloping down into that riparian area. So if you were to plant, or create swales, you'd want to, follow along those contour lines. So you're taking advantage of that slope where that water is going to be running down through spring melt or rain or groundwater. So just kind of shows how you would work with the land there, because everything, gravity wants to go down to the lowest point. And then this is a quick table just kind of showing some species that are really good, would be good for planting swale. So it shows the moisture tolerance. So looking for those, moist or wet species in that one column there, as well as, planting native species, because they're going to be able to work really well with your local environment. And then you can see some mid-story shrubs, upper trees, lower story herbaceous. So all those can be included, and all are going to bring different benefits as well as different aesthetic appeals. Yeah, so as again, I was mentioning all those ecosystem benefits. So swales can bring that to the land if that's something you're after. So reducing risk of flood on that, gently low or runoff on gently sloping landscapes. while at the same time recharging groundwater. Benefit of filtering out pollutants or excess nutrients with the tree roots or vegetation roots, as well as helping with erosion control, and providing, as those plants grow up, wildlife corridors where animals can safely travel between different habitats, ultimately increasing biodiversity on the land for many different species. Now we're going to kind of talk about carbon storage and how trees that are in shelterbelts and ecobuffers can help with that. So basically, it's always important to remember that the largest storage comes from the soil itself. And why it's always important, if you can avoid it, to not disturb treed areas, because the soil they have underneath them is a huge storage source for carbon. So our boreal soils tend to be very important and high in carbon storage. And the way that works is when they're disturbed, soils end up releasing their carbon, which is not good, as well as, destroying that environment that potentially can grab the excess carbon from the atmosphere. So as you can see, some boreal zones, 0.8 to 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare. So it's quite a bit. And shelterbelts have roughly, that 50% of the carbon is stored in the soils underneath them. And then when you remove them, the soils lose a lot of their ability to help store that carbon. So removing the land, not only do you stop that carbon storage process, you're also releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Certain different areas are really helpful, as well as wetlands, which can contain peat, which is a huge carbon store. So we'll be talking about that a little further on. And then when you go into the above ground storage, the actual tree, as opposed to the roots, they end up storing the remaining. So as you can see here, a mature forest can store over 10 tons of carbon per hectare. And they can the highest rate of storage usually happens when they're initially growing. And then when you get to a climax stage, the carbon capture rate slows down, but that storage rate is really immense. So that's when, if you do destroy climax stage forests, you're releasing a lot of carbon that is being held currently. Whereas forests that are in that stage, intermediate stage of growing, they're going to be capturing the most, but not necessarily having the highest storage. You can see again just some different cost benefits of carbon storage. So about $208 million at current carbon prices for shelterbelts that are able to capture some carbon, especially certain species. So I know hybrid poplar is really popular. Is a really popular tree species for carbon storage. It actually ends up being one of the better ones for shelterbelts. I think we have a graph or a target to show you that in a second here. So again, stressing that removed or not remove. There's a general trajectory as far as shelterbelts being removed across the prairie provinces. Well, at the same time, a lot of farmyards still have and maintain those shelterbelts, but we have a low, only about a third of farms having those field shelterbelts. So it's kind of important to kind of get that knowledge across of the importance of keeping them, as well as creating them on landscapes where they didn't exist in the first place. So some reasons for removal of those shelterbelts have been studied. And as you can see, kind of the two big ones are space for equipment and the age or death of trees. So concerning the age or death of trees, it seems to be that it might be costly to replace those trees, or they not necessarily know how to replace those trees, or what's the best way to go about, creating a shelterbelt. So that might be an issue, as well as space. Modern agricultural practices might not have the room to work with those trees. So it's not necessarily being against shelterbelts, but just having other forces come into play. So roughly around that 40% of landowners that were surveyed ultimately chose to remove their shelter belts simply because they were older or damaged. So again, that stresses, not necessarily knowing how to go about replacing that, or not wanting to based on, extra work or not having the time. As well as economic reasons like the machinery taken up, being in the way of machinery. A lot of landowners see shelter belts seen as taking up land that could be useful for growing crops, but not necessarily being aware of the ecosystem benefits that can be derived, ultimately increasing yield in some cases. So it's important to kind of get that education across. And next we have those the wetland. As far as clearing wetland areas or drainage areas or watershed areas for cropland or pasture land. So when landowners end up doing that, like I said before, it's a really big carbon storage landscape, those wetland areas. So by removing them, you're losing that, there you got a 0.7% drainage rate for carbon sequestration, as well as wetland restoration sequesters. Once you restore those wetlands, you're not getting the same amount that you had before, especially compared to when you're replacing that with an agricultural practice like no-till. So in terms of quantifying that, basically the carbon storage that you're getting out of the land by changing it to farmable land is way less than how it was as far as wetland. And then if you do go back to restoring that land, you're not replacing that same rate. So it's very easy to, I guess, take away that carbon potential, and it's very hard to replace it once you do that. So it's important to recognize the importance of wetlands, not just as water filtration systems or biodiversity targets, as well as their potential to hold that carbon. So you can see here, this is a classic example of a fen with forested land. And basically, these areas can contain peat, and that peat holds a lot of carbon. So basically, ideally, you don't want to be disturbing these areas. You want to keep them in their natural environment, because they end up doing more as they were than if they were being replaced with another human use for the landscape. So as I mentioned before, just kind of the rates of different trees. As you can see, when I was talking about the hybrid poplar, it has a pretty high value in terms of how much carbon it can sequester over its lifetime. And we got an interesting one data up there. 1 kilometer of shelterbelt can sequester up to 1460 in terms of tonnage of CO2 by the age of 60 years. And again, stressing that only half of that carbon storage is above ground. But each species will have a different carbon capture potential, and is ultimately affected by the shelterbelt characteristics. So a row of coniferous trees in a shelterbelt can store up to 300 kilograms of carbon per kilometer per year. But a 3-row deciduous belt can store up to 5,800 kilograms of carbon per kilometer per year. So, more is good. And then at carbon pricing, any future carbon credit programs can offer a tangible financial incentive for growing trees or maintaining them on your land. Unfortunately, Canada currently doesn't have any carbon pricing plan. I know certain provinces like Saskatchewan are in the kind of research phase for those. But just to consider for future prospects when hopefully we have those programs in place. The value, say, of carbon in Canada, roughly about $50 per ton of CO2. A single hybrid poplar tree could offer $150 to $250 in value. So it's definitely an incentive, not only just for protecting the environment, but a future income incentive as well. And then kind of hopping into the animal side of things with wildlife and livestock considerations. So shelterbelts, they can be excellent wildlife corridors, especially if you design them with that in mind. Basically, in doing that, you're creating a potential ability to provide food, breeding habitat, shelter and refuge, safe travel, assisting migration routes, and rest and connection to other habitats on the landscape. So best design basically is as wide, diverse, and as native as you can, as well as height is an important consideration. So you do need sufficient width and length because ultimately it provides more protection and will influence or encourage wildlife to use them. And proper placement is useful for habitat. You want to make sure those shelter belts are connecting to other natural features so they're not fragmented on the landscape. As well as, if you plant native species, native wildlife will utilize them, as well as creating a nice diverse selection of species. So using some coniferous trees for thermal shelter, fruit producing trees for food, shrubs for food and cover. So ultimately creating more biodiversity, which is higher resiliency for better natural pest control. So, encouraging natural predators to help out on the land, and ultimately encouraging wildlife use by avoiding any sort of maintenance on the shelter belt, such as thinning or pruning during the dormant period, avoiding it during the active breeding period. So ideally, if you're doing any maintenance, you want to do it during the dormant period, which is usually October to April, and that avoids disruption to nesting or breeding animals. And it's also recommended, if you can, to leave, a snag every roughly 200 feet, which is usually a dead or dying tree, or to install a perch for species to be able to use that, such as birds of prey and cavity nesters if it's a snag. And then, like I said before, just talking about that vertical habitat. So it's important to create those different layers, and you do that by creating that dome shape in your shelter belt. So you can see here, you're going to have the mature canopy layer all the way down to the shrub and deciduous layer. So each layer is going to offer different benefits for wildlife. So by mixing up those layers, you're creating a nice horizontal and vertical structure that allows more species to use it. So, kind of the old adage, build it and they will come. By doing that, you'll offer an enticing habitat for wildlife, as well as planting in consideration for the different needs at different times of the year. So certain species will produce food at different times, whether it's winter, fall, spring, summer, and ultimately will flower and seed at different times as well. And that mast, or the nourishment that species provide, can include nuts, seeds, berries, fruits, shrubs, vines, the leaves, as well as others. So basically, you want to make sure that you're using native species as well to help control exotic species, and make sure those needs of local wildlife are being met throughout the year. Classic example would be, seeing those Bohemian waxwings come in and take advantage of those berries that have been left on the tree to freeze and become edible, such as mountain ash. They really like mountain ash. And then going on, so some of the wildlife animals that potentially can be pests if they're a higher population in the area. So we got some hares, voles, and porcupines tend to be the big mammals that potentially can impact your planting, especially hares and voles for the seedlings, because they're lower to the ground and easy access, nice size for those. And porcupines, they have the ability to climb, so they can get after some of the bigger species. So big things you can do is prevent access as far as being environmentally friendly to them. So fencing and tubing are important tools in your repertoire. So for porcupines, you can end up wrapping a 30-inch aluminum flashing around trunks, and basically that prevents them from climbing, as opposed to, say, fencing or netting, which they can still climb over. So that helps with porcupines. Hares, if you can help, you can fence off a problematic area. So utilizing a 1-inch wire mesh at a height of about 3 feet, and ideally buried about 4 to 6 inches, basically to hinder their attempts at digging underneath. As well, you can fence off individual trees if they're being problematic to only a select few. And again, just wrapping them in that wire mesh at a height about 3 feet. But you also want to maintain about 6 inches of clearance away from the tree so that they can't press their snouts right up against the tree and munch away. As well as when you're planting those fences, always if you're in a winter climate, take into consideration that the snowpack is going to raise up. And some of those lighter animals like hares and bulls, they can go right on top and then get that extra height, potentially reach over a fence. So with voles, plastic tree guards are good. So the translucent plastic tubing where light can still pass through for the seedling, but basically it protects against the voles stacking on the seedlings. And these can be buried about 5 centimeters below the soil. And then another important one for voles is basically mowing around your plantings, removing that tall grass, which is a primary habitat for voles. And it can reduce that habitat and cover so they won't be as comfortable, as well as opening them up for predators such as birds of prey. Another thing you can do is in the winter, you can remove deep snow cover too around seedlings, because they can burrow underneath that and create tunnels, because they get the thermal protection from that. So here we just got a couple of good examples of tree fence around some younger trees, installing a perch for birds of prey primarily, keeping a snag there for potentially a hawk or a falcon to be able to look out on the land, and then a quick image of that plant using that aluminum flashing to prevent that porcupine from getting up there and potentially girdling some trees. And then, so the other side of that is livestock. So they can benefit and they can also potentially hurt some shelterbelts. So management's key there, and regulation. So if you are having livestock graze in treed areas such as shelterbelts or ecobuffers, ideally it's done at a low intensity and for short periods of time, and that's to protect the capacity of that shelterbelt. And then when you have grazing at sustained intensity, it can ultimately compact that soil and damage roots, especially with young trees. At the same time, grazing when used appropriately can help eliminate weeds and thin some trees out for tree competition. However, it's ultimately going to have an impact. So because that for forest productivity is going to be declined with grazing. So if that's will typically end up being the primary use if you're allowing grazing there, and you should focus around that goal. But again, there's strategies you can use to make sure that's going to be a sustainable practice, such as regulating that grazing with the carrying capacity for that treed area, directing your cattle or other livestock using portable water stations to encourage them for desirable distribution, using fencing. Portable fencing too can help with directing them and balancing that grazing out. And really important to just strictly avoid grazing when you have an initial planting or tree regeneration, and avoiding that during the spring period, so that it can regenerate from last year's forage. So yeah, rotational schedule, resting the land, monitoring are all important for if you're considering grazing within your shelterbelt or ecobuffer. So again, this image is a really good example of some of the different options you're going to have as far as utilizing grazing around trees. So you got that bottom natural area where it's kind of more of a classic woodland definition, where you have more open spacing and less ground cover.
And with the rows of trees on the top left there as well, they're spaced out so that the livestock is going to be foraging in between them ideally, but they're going to be getting the benefit of shade. So they have other options as opposed to strictly focusing on the treed areas. And then alley cropping. So you could kind of see it in that last photo where the cattle were in between the different rows there. So basically alley cropping is incorporating trees on your cropland or your pasture land in those rows. And basically choosing species that you can get productivity out of as far as harvesting or ecosystem service boosters. And again, when you're choosing species for alley cropping, always ensure that you're choosing compatible species that are going to be working with your crops or your pasture land rather than against, and potentially stealing vital nutrients or moisture. Alley cropping it's a form of intercropping. So it involves putting those trees in between forage crops or croplands and alleys, and choosing species for harvesting high value products such as firewood, biomass, timber, syrup, fruit producing species such as berries, and basically benefiting from all the other extra environmental services that they can help with, such as nutrient accumulation or moisture tolerance, moisture accumulation, and nitrogen fixating, like I said before, with the fruit production, and filtering out pollutants, excess nutrients, pest suppression. And then it's always important to consider that if it's your first time doing it, that taking out that cropland or pasture land is going to be a decline at first, while those trees grow up before they are marketable or able to produce. And again, just stressing that choose compatible species so you're getting benefits both ways as opposed to a one-sided deal, as well as planting on that north-south axis, so you're having sunlight and shade at different times, so you're not completely isolating in terms of shade or sunlight. Yeah, I think that's good, as well as if you're choosing species that are going to be growing tall, you want to make sure that they have a decent crown porosity so that some sunlight can get through and they're not too dense to add up too much shelter and compete too much. So it might be a blurry slide, and it's a lot of data on this slide, but ultimately it just kind of goes over some really good alley cropping species and kind of the products that they can produce, as well as their planting zone. So depending on what you're going after, there's lots of different options, whether you want to just plant them solely for their ecosystem benefits, such as nitrogen fixing, or improving the soil, or getting that fruit production or wood harvesting. So lots of options. And then tying into both wildlife and livestock, the shelterbelt fencing. So you want to make sure you're using proper design, basically to make sure it's wildlife friendly, because they're going to be coming over it no matter what. But at the same time, keeping livestock out of areas you don't want them to go. And working with the topography, certain areas are going to work really well with fencing, some not so much. And ideally, picking a design that's going to be low maintenance. I'm just going to down here. So yeah, keeping that livestock out, like I said before, to avoid damaging or trampling those planted areas or those sensitive shelter-built areas you don't want interfered with. So what you can do for that, put up a fence. And the way you can go about that is to generally work with the land. So depressions and ridges on the landscape will funnel wildlife. So ideally you want to be able to aim to keep those barrier free, as opposed to setting up a fence there. As well as you want to make sure that certain areas aren't completely inaccessible to wildlife, such as water, vital habitat, important travel corridors. At the same time, ensuring that your livestock are being kept out of riparian areas to avoid damage to them as well. Ideal to avoid slopes with fencing if you can, because basically that creates a higher distance to clear or jump. Because the ideal fence for wildlife is something that they can jump over and is clearly visible, and that way you can avoid entanglement. So kind of a quick dimension, it'd be ideally top wire at around 40 inches or less, with the top 2 wires as far as spacing having greater than 12 inches apart. But basically to avoid that, hoof entanglement, as you can see in that photo. And having that bottom wire at a certain height above the ground too is good for younger animals, so they can crawl over if they're not old enough to be able to jump. So something like 18 inches above the ground. For that, you can flag or create visual markers for your wildlife fence, so they can see it. And if you can get away with it, smooth wire is always recommended, at least for the top 2 and the single bottom wire, again, to prevent entanglement by birds or wounds to wildlife jumping. And as well, you can help with integrating it with your livestock uses by making sure that you have, openings, or you can lay down sections, and then that way it's not, a permanent structure that you have to work around for moving livestock in and out. And if you're cutting through, say, a woodlot or parts of your shelter belt, ideally, if you can clear trees on either side, that it creates visibility for wildlife and livestock, so they're not coming into contact with that, and it can be avoided. So this image right here is kind of an example of what can happen if with your fencing, if you're not allowing or keeping out livestock. So this is a shelter belt that's kind of seen better days, and it's not looking too good. And basically what happened is it ended up getting overbrowsed and over trafficked by livestock in the area. So ideally, you kind of want to avoid that by setting up good design for your fencing. And you can see the fencing on the right here, as opposed to on the left, is the wooden fence. And fences like that, can work with keeping certain livestock out. While at the same time, really good for wildlife, because jumping that, they're not going to have anything to get entangled. Easy to go under, easy to jump, as well as, birds and bats aren't going to get entangled on the barbed wire of other fencing. So I've been talking for a long time, so hopefully you're not tired of my voice. But at this point, we're going to pass it off to Megan, and she's going to carry on with basically the general practice of establishing a shelter belt and all the different steps you have to go through for that. So I will leave off here.
Thank you, Bob. So Bob helped put together the presentation, and we went through it. To prepare for today. And what was missing was all the worst case examples. So I dug back through photos of my family farm, and I have come through, you guys. So all those terrible do not do examples. So that's, how I come to be interested in planting trees on farmland. It's learning what not to do, and I learned it from the best. I've got more photos to show you, so don't be too horrified yet. There's more good ones coming right up. So establishing a shelter belt. We've got a good one here in our example. So this one's in the Grand Prairie area. We've got your good row of poplar here. We've got some spruce going to be established in the middle, and then your other older poplar in the background there. And you can see they're starting to die off on top. So that's your shelter belt. Your poplars are starting to reach the end of their lifespan there. There we go. All right, so steps to establishing your shelter belt. So you're going to start off with your design, and you're taking into consideration all of those points that Bob has previously discussed today, and all of those ecosystem services that you're looking for in your design. You're going to use that information along with your site assessment to finalize your design. Select your species. You're going to determine your site preparation, your stock, where you're going to source your stock and what type of stock you're going to purchase, any kind of your planting plan, how you're going to plant these trees in the ground, how you'll control the weeds and do other maintenance as well. So using all of that information that you've gathered already, so keeping in mind your goals, your landscape, all of the different things to consider. You want to look at what you have to work with and determine exactly what you're planning, how you're planning to move forward. Cool. So you can use an aerial photo. We recommend using Google Maps, Google Pro to do something like that. You can find really excellent aerial photography of the area, nice and clear. And using that, you can draw right on there with the tools your belts, your shelter belts, your linear buffers, or even polygons for when you're doing, perhaps you're doing some underplanting or inplanting of forested areas on your property. So using the Google Earth Pro, you can visualize those features, as well as you can measure, as well you can even measure how great a distance it is. So you can measure the distance of your linear lines of planting, and that helps you determine spacing, given spacing requirements, how many trees you may need for that planting. So you work with your goals. This farmer is looking to protect his barnyard there from dusting snow, blowing snow and dust, increase moisture, and working with the site conditions and prevailing winds that he has. So on here you can see he's doing a 5-row shelter belt around his homestead there, and then a 3-row shelter belt along the main road to provide a buffer. In his phase 2 of his design, once he has more capacity to continue maintaining trees, because that's something that you always have to consider, is how much time do you have to water trees if they need to maintain weeds. Given how much time you have, you may choose to do planting in phases. So phase 2 for this farmer looks like adding some additional 2-row shelter belts in here. So along the ephemeral stream, some alley cropping rows here to keep wind under control, trap snow, increase pollinators, as well as another shelter belt on the north side of the property there. So something to think about when you're determining if you're planting a traditional shelter belt or perhaps an eco-buffer. An eco-buffer, by nature, they're using mainly native species. Of course, you can have some non-native species in there too, but Oz always prefers natives. And you're looking to plant in a much, a dense planting pattern. So you're getting kind of the most trees in there. These trees, native species, are going to be working together to help each other to increase growth rate, as well as provide the barriers and functions that they may need to optimize growth. So planted quite dense. This eco-buffer here, key patterns, 1 meter by 2 meter spacing. Every 6th plant is tall, so you can see those blue X-shaped trees. Those nurse trees are tall, as well as the tall green trees there. And then you've got your shorter-lived shrubs, and those are favored on the outside of your eco-buffer. So the shorter-lived species are favored on the outside to create that dome shape that you're always looking for. Let me see. I can pause. Are there any questions on eco-buffers or shelter belts that anyone has specifically for designing? No, before I get too ahead of myself, you're welcome to just take yourself off mute as well.
So there's been some great chatter in the chat, and both you and Bob have been doing a good job of trying to address those comments as we go. There is one here that was just put in. I'm not sure who Play 2 is, whatever your screen name is. You're welcome to unmute and say it, but maybe I'll just read it out here. With a single row of Swedish aspen planted 2 years ago, about 8 foot in height, is it better to add a row of mature pine trees in front of or behind the poplar? The poplars are exposed to strong west winds. Would the pine trees be a good wind buffer in front? I planted 40 feet from the neighbor's property line, but don't want to cause any problems by getting too close. Thank you.
Let me see. So your question, you're trying to protect your poplars from the wind, or are you trying to protect what's on the other side of your poplars?
Okay, so I'm wondering about protecting the poplars. So it's kind of a combination. I don't want to get too close to the neighbor. But then I'm thinking if the pine trees go on the west side of the poplars, the wind would be hitting them first. And I'm wondering then if it would offer some protection for the poplars, because the pine trees that I'll be getting are more established and more mature right now than the poplars.
So the poplars are going to grow very rapidly, and your pine trees really aren't going to be able to keep up. So given the rate of growth of the species, I'm hesitant to say that the pine would provide a lot of protection. Likely the poplars will be poking up above your pine trees fairly quickly.
Okay, so would just go with then, like when you talk about having the shrubs in front, then say instead of the pine trees, work with more of a buffer zone to create, you know, kind of that slope. Go with the shrubs, yeah, and then the poplar and then the pine.
That's how I would recommend it, just because those shrubs are going to grow quickly to create that ramp, and your pine trees are going to provide that longevity. If you go back to Bob's example of, I can even go back in the slides.
Yeah, you should have it.
Of how fast the species are growing.
Yeah, it's all about matching those age rates, so you can maintain that that fullness in your shelter build. So like Megan was saying, with the ideally the fast growing shrubs to get that initial ramp to lift up the wind, should help at least with the brunt, where the wind will mostly be making contact with, say, the tops of the poplars as opposed to the structural integrity of it.
And then would you suggest about to maybe have that third row, then have the poplar to the pine trees have about 10 feet in spacing behind, front to back?
Yes,
so
we typically.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, at least 2 meters, or I guess 2 meters is 6 feet. So 9 feet should be all right for that.
Okay.
They would be touching at the bottom, and not likely too much at the top.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so in the example here, I guess you'll be looking for this kind of a shape in Bob's longevity chart here.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Planting another row of columnar aspens kind of to protect and supplement the 8 foot tall would help, and they would grow kind of staggered growth there. Might be an idea. So you'd have a row of shrubs and then another row of your columnar aspens there, like a more junior columnar aspens, and then more mature columnar aspens and your pine.
Oh, okay.
If you have the space and the desire to do so, that might be an option as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me just click through.
Oh yeah, and then all the chat about woodpeckers, it's interesting. And everybody's very correct in that they usually will go after trees that already have issues, especially if they're already decaying on the inside, because that's what they want as far as that insect infestation. So yeah, usually even if they're traditional woodpeckers that like pileated woodpeckers or downies or hairies, they can't do enough damage on their own to bring down a tree. But sapsuckers are kind of another, that's a different area, because they potentially can, because the way they drill those rows of holes, they can potentially girdle a tree. So that's kind of a different case as opposed to kind of the classic woodpeckers.
Yeah, I would recommend the predator posts to attract some of those predatory birds, make the woodpeckers less likely to be frequent, feeders in the yard. At the same time, some of those woodpeckers are migratory birds, so they're protected under the Migratory Bird Act. So just, keep that in mind when you're looking at control options. Stock selection. So now that you have your planting plan, you have your where you're going to be planting all laid out, how your length of your rows, and a good idea of how much maintenance you can do, phases and everything. You want to look at stock selection. So planning what stock to purchase and use for your shelter belt. You've got our selection here look to be Colorado blue spruce. And then a junior row of Colorado blue spruce in the front. It's like a pine also, just thrown in the mix there. So I know we've mentioned or we brought up this slide a few times before. So in planting your shelter belt, traditionally you see a lot of those rows of all the same type of tree planted in a row, and very visually appealing. You can see some nice consistency there. Something to point out, and from a conversation with someone we had on Wednesday, sometimes when diseases move through your shelter belt, or sapsuckers, if they're in the area, they can go from one tree to the next down the shelter belt. So adding some variety in there is something to break up that single species row really goes a long way in preventing major losses. So in this circumstance, you may lose one or two trees, but eventually that break of a different species can help mitigate damage from pests or diseases that are moving through your row of species. Planting stock to consider. So there's lots of different options when you're purchasing your stock. So you can plant stakes. Here we have some stakes, lots of different species. You can clip stakes, I guess cuttings from your trees, and plant them right in the ground, moist spring ground. Also, you can source bare root seedlings. There's a few different sizes of plugs as well available at most of your local nurseries. So that would be something, conversation to have with a nursery staff, see what might be the best option, both price point as well as handling, the type of care that they may need, and then the type of size and type of plant that you're looking for, depending on the care that you're able to give them. So some of these little guys may be a little more cost effective, but in overall, if you're looking at maybe increasing the amount you'll have to replant in future years to overcome some losses, considering a bigger stock might be an option or something to consider. So these little, the little plugs and bare root species, they're pretty, they're pretty vulnerable. So you'll need to take care of them if you're getting those in the spring. They come. Like this are the plugs, the bare roots. There's no soil on those, so they need to be kind of kept from drying out, as well as planted right away. Container plugs, so they're grown in small containers for 1 or 2 years, and they're grown right in that soil. The bare plug species, they're grown in the nursery for 2 years, and then they're dug up and they're sold when they're dormant. So spring stock, they're typically sold in the early spring, and they're just coming out of dormancy as you receive them from the nurseries, and so they need to be kept cool and protected until they're planted in the ground, typically 1 week after you receive them. So you don't want to keep those exposed for any length of time. You'll kind of shock the trees, and you'll have a lot more trouble keeping those trees do well once they're planted. Let's see the stakes and cuttings, as I mentioned in the previous page. So they're harvested from local plant material, and they're planted either in the, you harvest and plant them right in the fall, or you can harvest those over the winter. You can store them in a snowpack, so in a snowbank, during the winter until the ground has thawed out in the spring, and you plant those right into the soil in the springtime. So you don't want to have too much exposure for those cuttings. They're utilizing all of their energy from the bark of the cutting. So you want to maintain them in good condition and plant them right away. That bark energy needs to go into developing the roots of the cutting. So planting them before they put too much energy into developing buds, as well trimming off the majority of the buds if they do have them, can help survival for cuttings. We have a couple good reference sheets on that, fact sheets, so we can, if you're looking for more information on cuttings, you can look. We can provide that. Let's see, site prep. So preparing your site, something definitely gives your seedlings an advantage depending on your site. There's lots of different methods of preparing your site to consider. Some of the most standard site prep that you'll see, especially for linear shelter belts and linear plantings, is to rototill the soil so it's nice and loose. It's often referred to as garden soil. So you most folks know that consistency. You're doing that to overcome a sod mat. So here along this riparian buffer here in a farmer's field, you can see there's quite a bit of that sod mat there that they're overcoming. Sometimes spraying may be helpful in overcoming the sod mat in the soil there. Really taking away that competition helps give the new seedlings a chance at getting established. As well, you're looking to loosen the soil. So if there's any compaction there, you're going to loosen that up through tilling the soil and give those new seedlings, give those roots a chance to get established and access some of that deeper moisture a little more easily. In our examples here, we have, they've prepared the soil by rototilling, and then they've installed a biodegradable mulch that they're planting into. So they're installing the mulch over top of the seedlings and then cutting that mulch after to let the seedlings poke through. In this example here, they're planting with their shovel right into the mulch. So in this example, due to using the shovel right into the mulch, you have a slightly larger hole in your mulch and you can have more weeds growing right out of that hole there. Whereas if you're planting and cutting a small hole around the already planted seedling, you have a smaller hole and less weeds can poke through there right with your seedling. All right. So some other types of site prep, if you're not planning on doing a linear planting, or you're looking for an alternative method opposed to doing that, all of the tilling, I suppose, you can do some site prep for the individual trees. So there's a couple different mounding techniques. Using a small excavator to do the mounding here in this picture. Picture A, you can pull back a mound and plant throughout without necessarily planting in a linear row. As well, a Brachy Mounder. So this is another piece of equipment you can pull behind like a large tractor, and it essentially pulls up mounds as you drive along. So that's somewhat linear, though not like you think. So it drives through the field and it pulls around, causing mounds to be pulled up. There's lots of videos online if you are looking to see how that works. You can Google it, Brachy Mounder, and you'll see some videos on how that functions. So definitely pros and cons to both. The excavator, you can kind of choose to excavate those mounds wherever you like. The Brachy Mounder, it drives along and does those mounds. So yeah, you need to have areas where you can get in there a little more easily. All right, so here, mounding, this Bob made us an excellent diagram to show exactly how mounding works. So you have when you have the mound, it just scoops this up and dumps it over here.
Oh, that one
So
wasn't
I've
wasn't my mastery,
Oh.
that one. Sorry. Yeah, just don't want to take credit for it.
Oh, I was thinking this was yours. It's a good one all the same. So you have the bottom of the mound, the top of the mound, and the hinge. So you've got 3 options for planting in your mound, as well as in a trench. So if you're digging a trench with a trenching tool, we've discussed, we've discussed trenching in our root pruning discussion on Monday as well. So a trench would just be a linear mound. Both of those having the bottom, the hinge on the top. So when you're, when you're looking to have less of an area disturbed as opposed to tilling, mounding, it only disturbs about 10 to 30% of the ground surface if you're doing kind of a similar planting as Shelterbelt. Mounds have the ability to increase the survival of seedlings because you can choose to do your planting on the bottom, the hinge, or the top, all of which provide different benefits. So that bottom planting, there's more moisture and more protection in the bottom of the planting there. So if you're planting maybe on the, somewhere a little drier, a little higher wind, you're looking to plant in that bottom area where your new seedling will see better protection and better moisture. If you're looking to kind of get above the moisture, you can plant in the top of that mound there where you'll get more exposure to kind of sunshine, air, and less moisture. So essentially the structure of the mound can be used. You can use that different ways on your landscapes. If you have varying topography with some areas that are lower and some areas that are higher, you can kind of plant plant to the site conditions where your mound is located as well. There's always that middle part of the hinge there too, if you're really looking to just get the best of both. Planting on the hinge is an option as well. Okay, I think I covered all my points on that one. Each mound can be used strategically to maximize the survival of the different seedlings in the environment. And then you've got trenching, so you just think of that as a continuous mound, and you utilize that along your stretch of planting in the same fashion. So if you're starting your trench at the top of the hill, plant in the bottom of that mound, and if you're ending your trench at the bottom of the hill, you want to move up to planting on the top of the mound. So working with your environment there. We've got a little bit of more information on the different benefits of those different locations in the mound. So the extremely wet bottom, or if you're looking in extremely wet conditions, plant on the top, and if you're looking for more moisture, plant on the bottom. All right, planting. So there's lots of different thoughts on planting, hiring planters, using the planting equipment, planting yourselves, and depending on the type of stock you have, you want to look to what might be the best option for planting. So always handle your stock with care. It doesn't matter how you're planting it, you need to take care of those seedlings so they have their best chance. You can look to your counties. They are often planting tractors that you could rent to help with your planting. And if you're going to do hand planting, we recommend investing in a planting shovel. Essentially that shovel, the shape and economics of the planting shovel really make it worthwhile if you're doing a large number of plantings. So you're going to get the best survival rates of your trees if you're using the right equipment and you have the right technique as well. You're going to minimize your potential for injury if you're using the right tools and you have the right technique. Our picture here, we have a planting tool. So these are really effective in making sure that these trees are planted and they are getting, all of the air pockets are getting out during planting. So you have kind of a good start to your seedlings there. All right, so there's a fact sheet as well. If you are going to be doing the planting yourself, you can look at some of the different techniques to use for planting. You do want to ensure that you are following the right procedure so the trees have the best chance. It seems kind of simple enough, though, working with planting crews, especially seeing the difference between a group of volunteer planters who don't have experience and a group of professional planters who have extensive amount of experience. You'll see a difference in your survival rate of your seedlings. So looking at technique is important for planting and ensuring success of your site. Some things that could go wrong with planting, again, this infographic is in our planting fact sheet that we can provide. A lot of times planting too deep is kind of one of the main things that we see, so really just keep an eye out on planting to make sure that isn't happening. As well, depending on the type of stock that you're purchasing, you can have, you can run into some issues. So bare root stock, you can see a little more of the L and the G roots. Depending on the consistency of your soil and the time of year, you want to really be conscious of air pockets, so packing those seedlings in nicely. Can really impact survival of your planting species. See, moving on to maintenance. So maintenance is always something that folks need to expect when they're doing their planting. So the best trees, the fastest growing trees are the ones that you're looking after. So you want to ensure your maintenance. So weed control, this can be done mowing, tilling, and pulling, spot spraying, whatever suits your whatever suits yourself, whatever suits your project. We prefer mowing over tilling. A lot of times this is kind of what folks think of when they have their shelter belt. They're going to rototill around that shelter belt to keep the weeds at bay. There's a lot of reasons why that might not be the greatest option. You're definitely keeping the weeds at bay. However, in keeping that soil bare for many years, I know the shelter belt's several years old here, you can kind of cause that loss of organic material in the soil, and you're impacting the entire soil network. So you're really impacting the long-term viability of the soil, and it's going to take several years to come back from that, the loss there through tilling as well. Something to consider in keeping the soil exposed and black like that. You really don't have any vegetative cover, and you're losing your organic carbon there. So you're losing the ability of the soil to mitigate fluctuations in temperature and moisture. So in decreasing all of that organic matter, your soil will change temperature rapidly throughout the day and night, as well as moisture will change a lot more rapidly as well. So both of those things can cause stress to your trees and impact their survival. Maintenance. So weed control is important as well in the first 3 years, as well as watering. Our pictures here, we have a drip irrigation system. This can be laid out at the base of trees. Often these lines are covered with your biodegradable mulch when you are using that system for maintenance on your trees. So drip irrigation, that consists of a plastic pipe laid underneath the mulch. There's small holes there that will distribute water right to the roots of trees. You can use rainwater collected from a farm building to water those trees. I know my family, they pump water out of a dugout, fill up the water truck, and they can water the trees just like when they water their farm garden. So something like that is very effective, and you want to make sure you're checking. You want about 10 centimeters down in the ground to make sure those trees, the roots, water is getting all the way to the roots. And then watering your trees, that can help reduce heat stress, especially in the summer when things might be a bit drier. That's so the irrigation equipment is something that previously folks have been utilizing CAP funding to help with, as well as fencing. That's something to keep keep an eye on CAP funding for moving forward in the future, potentially, and hopefully they'll open up funding for another couple years and folks can access that as well. A little bit more about mulching. So we have different types of mulching can be used to control weeds. So this biodegradable mulch here, you can have 3-year, 5-year biodegradable mulch, depends on the thickness of the mulch. You can also utilize non-biodegradable mulch. I was at a site over the fall, I think about 25-year-old alley cropping planted, the mulch was still going strong. So really keep in mind, if you're not choosing the biodegradable option, that it will be there on your landscape for a very long time. So upwards 30 years more. You'll have to remove that yourself if you so choose. But the biodegradable, if you're looking to have that kind of just disappear on its own, is your best choice. Alternate options, you've got a pulp mat or a hemp mat. Those aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily have the longevity of the biodegradable plastic mulch. As well, you need to secure, ensure you're securing these to the ground. So there's those stakes, like camping stakes that you stake in there, so they don't get lifted up by wind that comes through. Alternate options for mulching, you can use grass clippings, straw clippings, composted manure I've seen used as well. So it really just depends what you have on hand. And keep in mind there's pros and cons to all of the mulch alternatives as well. So something like straw mulch, those natural mulches, they're a lot more favorable to voles, for example, or gophers. They like to kind of hide in that material. These little mulch mats, they tend to blow up if there's a huge wind event and they aren't staked down really well. The biodegradable, I've seen projects where wildlife, deer have walked down the mulch. It's the easiest path of least resistance. They walk down the mulch, and there was little hoof print holes in it the entire way down the shelter belt. So you really want to kind of choose the best option for your project. And keep in mind there's pros and cons to all options. All right, so why mulch? Let's see. So reducing vegetation competition. So that's the number one that comes to mind is keeping weeds back. And it does an excellent job. Absolutely works for that purpose. Water conservation is another one that's often comes to mind. So you're going to reduce your need to water if you do have that mulch in place there. It protects from evaporation. It regulates the soil temperature, so it provides that cover, thermal cover, especially if you're using something like straw, grass, or any of the natural mulches. It'll improve the soil condition simply through protecting it and creating a favorable environment for all of that soil kind of bacteria and microorganisms to flourish. As well, consolidated and unconsolidated mulches both have different benefits. So you're gonna look to work some of that organic material in if you're using some of that organic material. And with these biodegradable mulches, you're gonna look to see that either remain on your landscape or not remain on your landscape. Oh, and I have a note to remind everyone that the healthy plants are the ones that have consistent access to water and nutrients. So mulching really plays a role in that, increasing the competitiveness and survival of your shelter belt. So you want to make sure the trees do have access to those good conditions, especially in those first years. Right. So when you're using your mulching as weed control, you can mow around it to keep the weeds down. You can use further biodegradable mulches. You can see to cover crop, and you can use a variety of different options there. So we kind of tend not to recommend keeping the soil bare, though that is an option that's out there. Oz recommends cover crops. So some cover crops, essentially the idea there is planting a crop to cover the soil. So you're just planting something that's going to outcompete any of the weed seed bank that's existing in the soil. So this cover crop, it can be clover, it can be a fast growing annual, just something that is going to cover that soil up and make any weed seeds less able to germinate because there's something else growing there already. So cover crops, they're recommended to maintain the soil health during planting and establishment, and especially when trees are very young. They can help trees have access to light, water, and nutrients. So depending on the type of cover crop that you have planted, we recommend tilling in the fall where you're going to be planting your cover crop in the fall or in the spring so that your cover crop can become well established. And then you're going to rototill or till just a small swath right into your cover crop, lay your mulch, and plant your seedlings in that. So this ensures that your seedlings are outcompeting any tall grasses or any other vegetation. They're receiving the light and the water and the nutrients. And especially in choosing a cover crop that fixes nitrogen or has some other benefits, your trees can see that benefit as well. So another note here, if you're looking to not do any maintenance, plant a really low height cover crop. So something like alfalfa that grows quite tall. You might want to choose like a low growing red clover, white or red clover instead, so you're not having to mow very often. If you're using a species like rye that sometimes can survive the winter, you want to make sure to mow that so then seed heads aren't spreading outside of where you want that to occur. And then I guess in kind of working towards your objectives of the cover, you want a fast, very fast establishing cover crop that you can easily control. All right, so effective mulching, we've got some more points there. Lay the mulch as flat as possible, ensure coverage, pull the mulch back from the stems of the seedling. So you want to ensure that the mulch is secured down to the ground, and reapply your mulch. So sometimes, especially with some of those little mats, you can reapply those. So they just tuck around the tree and you reapply if they start to break down or they blow away. Want to keep those in good condition to keep the weeds down. Maintenance. All right, so you want to replant as soon as you can if you're looking for that wind control. Planting in a grouping with some nurse trees for some of those established shelter belts is highly recommended. As well, any kind of pruning or gap filling is a good option as well from shelter belts. Let's see. So we have our next section, and I'll kind of move through it fairly quickly. Shelter belt restoration. Do we have any questions on the planting before we move forward?
There were a few about some of the pieces of equipment, but Bob has kind of answered them, as have a couple other people in the chat. So I think we're pretty good.
Okay. Well, I'll move right into some of this shelter belt restoration. And we have, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Oz does have a presentation for shelter belt restoration coming up later in the spring. And we'll go into a lot more detail on some more detail. We'll just go over a quick example now. So shelter belt restoration, a lot of shelter belts were planted many years ago on the farm, like this one here, down the road from my parents' place. The large poplars, they're getting older and they're they're at the end of their lifespan. But these huge trees are now falling into the field. So there's, it's hard to drive your tractor through there when there's the giant poplar in the way. And what do you do? So now what do you do about this? So removal of dead trees, I guess, is kind of the first thing that comes to mind. When trees are getting older, there's some of that dead growth on them that you're going to look to remove. You're going to want to keep an eye on. As the trees are getting older, they're more vulnerable to insects and diseases. So you want to really keep an eye on that. Make sure to take care of anything that comes up rather quickly. Like I said, your trees are older, they're more vulnerable to some of the pests that move through. Depending on the location and where the dead trees are located, you can replant in the same location. Depending on the type of shelter belt that was planted there before, the type of length of, yeah, I guess, depending on how long the shelter belt was in place and the different types of trees that were planted there, you may need to mitigate some of the soil conditions before planting. So there's some species that can aid in mitigating soil conditions and maybe be planted first, other species to be planted later. Overall, this is something you probably want to avoid. Aging shelter belt, the trees have been topped to prevent them from falling over into the field. A lot of that new growth suckering out of the top of the topped trees, it's fairly vulnerable to any wind events. A lot of that will be kind of fallen off of the tree. It's not very structurally sound. As well, in removing a lot of this dead material, you'll open up the, you'll open up more light and air and water available for any newer trees that are growing in the understory there, so they can grow and fill in your shelter belt. So you want to remove any of that dead material to give the newer trees more of a chance to establish. Underplanting is something that we see in some of the older shelter belts. So a lot of species, especially little spruce species, are really adapted to growing in that understory. So they're going to grow in that understory using the shelter of the older shelter belt to reestablish. All right. Oh, keep in mind the lifespan of your trees. So a lot of these trees, some are long-lived, some are short-lived. In planning and shelter belt renovation, it's something to consider. The age of the species and how many more years are you expecting to have this on your property. So do you need to develop a succession plan for your shelter belt? Perhaps planting a row in front or in behind if you do have the space, just anticipating that some of those older trees won't be providing longevity into the future. So you'll have another row potentially providing the same service, the same windbreak coming up and ready. Filling in the gaps is something too important depending on the site. Companion planting, as well as looking to plant protection nurse plants, nurse crops, condition the soil. Understory planting, oh, I kind of already talked about that one. So here we have a little spruce planted in the understory there to come up as the aging shelter belt. And then funding. So when you're looking at doing any new shelter belts, redeveloping your shelter belt, we have some kind of notes here on funding. There's lots of different sources of funding available in Alberta. We can provide kind of some links to different websites that we utilize. As well, feel free to reach out to Oz. ALUS as well has some information on funding for counties where ALUS programs are running. CAP, like we had mentioned, so that was one of the bigger sources of funding previously. I'm not sure on the status of that, though we'll have information going out to all of the members on Oz's newsletter. I'm sure ALUS will as well when we do hear some news on the CAP program in the future. Land Stewardship Center, they offer grants primarily for riparian buffers. county shelter belt programs are a good source to look for funding for trees, reduced costs on trees. A lot of the counties are purchasing large tree orders from nurseries, so they're getting bulk pricing on those trees, sometimes subsidizing that pricing to ensure that landowners in those counties can move forward with successful shelter belt programs. And then there's a lot of other organizations out there. So the Alberta Conservation Association, Nature Conservancy Canada, Ducks Unlimited, even some of the private businesses. So the TD Friends of the Environment grant or Co-op Community Spaces grant. There tends to be many of them out there if you're looking for opportunities. And talking with folks in your area as well, a lot of different community organizations are looking to plant trees in your community, so that would be a place to look as well. Some local resources for sourcing trees, mulch mats, equipment. This will be something Oz will have to look into some of our sources and ask if it's all right to share their information. So some of the Alberta nurseries, we have a few on our list here. These are the ones that we were able to contact. I know Boreal and Woodmere, you'll need a corporate account for some of these. The little arrow or the little asterisk there. Oz typically does orders for landowners that we're working with, and we can kind of make sure that your order goes in with ours. If that's something that you so choose, like reach out to us. Count equipment rentals, a lot of the counties, and I know County Northern Lights has some equipment available for shelter belt planting if you're looking for some equipment. And they'll also have information on other ways to access equipment if you so need it. Let's see. Okay, and I think that's all that I had prepared questions. So if anyone has any questions, or Bob, if you have anything to add.
No, we could, definitely open up for questions. I had 3 little polls, but I know we're running low on time, so we don't necessarily have to do those if we want to open a question period here. So.
I can always throw the polls up, and then we can open it up for people to ask, like unmute and ask questions while those are going on too.
Sure.
So, yeah, okay. Well, let's start with this first one then. So it's just, why do you want to create or why, like, may you want to create or restore a shelter belt or ecobuffer? And you can choose as many as you'd like. And just a reminder, if you have questions for the Oz team, feel free to unmute there. I know they've done a great job of answering some questions in the chat. But one question that had come up that was answered, but I think would be good for everyone to hear anyways, is Karina had asked, how does the planting tool work? It looks quite interesting.
Oh yeah, that planting machine, Megan.
The pull behind planting machine?
I think so, yeah.
So it has, it creates a furrow, kind of, that's what you don't see when you're looking at the photo there. How many is it back? Maybe I can bring it back up on the screen. It creates a furrow in the, before the, well, here we go. So that furrow is created in the front of the machine there, right in the front, with a plow-shaped tool. And then you put your trees in here, and these 2 tires pack that plow around the tree and provide that pressure to remove any air voids that might be in the soil. So you simply put your tree in ahead of the plow, and then these tires pack that tree in. So they're essentially packing it. I think the soil's a little bit dry in this in this photo, but you don't want it too wet either. So you kind of want that right soil moisture level when you're using equipment like that.
Great. Thanks, Megan.
Great. Thank you very much.
It's very effective for planting large quantities of trees and quite economic. Though I should say in planting, hiring planters, it's very effective as well. They can plant a lot of trees in a day, so that's something to consider. Something to consider if you are planting a large amount of trees. Two very good options.
So I shared those poll results, and there's a really good mix of lots of different motivations, and they're all equally fantastic. Definitely seems to be a lot of interest in sort of like home improvement stuff, sheltering and beautifying, you know, area around home, garden, that kind of thing. But also really high was like wind and snow break and pollinator services. So that's really neat. Okay, so we did have a question also from Rob here. Does Oz do on-site consultation? And if so, what is the cost?
Absolutely, and we do on-site consultation. It depends on what you're looking for in your consultation. As well, often we do have funding from some corporate funders that cover part or all of consultation fees. I know last year we received funding from the Alberta Real Estate Association, so we could go out and visit, I think, 40 landowners over last summer and do some consultations. Using that funding. So depending on the year, we do have funding and time available for doing consultations. So if you could send an email to Oz, and we can let you know how that process works.
Great. And just sharing the results of that poll too there. It seems like we have a lot of coniferous tree lovers here.
Yeah, team coniferous.
It's kind of a fun question. All right, I'll just throw the last one up and ask this last question that was coming up. So what would you suggest for tillage depth before planting saplings for best results?
So it depends on, it depends on your site conditions. Typically we'll suggest about 30 to 40 centimeters. So what you're tilling for, you're looking to break up any compaction so that the roots of the trees have favorable conditions to grow into. So if you're looking at any soil that's really compacted, you can see impacts to the seedlings. They will have a harder time growing into some of that compacted soil as well. We've seen in really compacted soil, some of the seedlings just growing right out of the ground. So some loosening of the soil is often needed, and then depending on your area, it really depends how much and how deep, typically around 40 centimeters.
Great, thank you. And it's 9 o'clock on the nose, so let's wrap up here. I guess we'll just share the last results. So it looks like accessing some of the programs like carbon credit programs and things like that may pop up in the future, or maybe things that are even available now, might be really good incentives to make sure that there's more treed areas on your property. So that's great. Thank you all for sharing your Friday night with us. That is amazing. I'm really impressed with the number of people that attended and how engaged everybody was. So we really appreciate that. And for those that attended Monday and Friday session, extra thank you. You spent a good portion of your week with us. We will be wrapping up next week. We will send out links to the recordings, as well as some additional resources that Oz has put together. And I believe the PDFs of the slides as well.
We can send them PDFs of the slides as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and then we will also send out a survey too to find out what you thought of the session. So definitely keep any of those thoughts in mind. We really appreciate any kind of constructive feedback. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Megan and Bob, for sharing your expertise with us. We
Welcome, yeah.
appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's wonderful to share. It's great to share, information on growing trees, more trees. Yeah, more tree services.
Great. If there's any other like burning, lingering questions, I'm gonna throw Megan and Bob under the bus and say that maybe they wouldn't mind hanging on another 5 minutes or so if there's anything.
Yeah, no problem.
It's still on there, but otherwise, thanks so much and have a great night, everyone.